جزاء. السلام عليكم.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah khair for having me here. Thank you to Sabil for starting this organization and for many of us that are in this age demographic and fulfilling a need that I think was really needed in our community. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So my background, I'm from here. I did my undergrad and grad from Rutgers, bachelor's in psychology, master's in social work. That was about 10 years ago. Alhamdulillah, I have been in practice since then, working with a variety of clients. Right now, I have my own practice. My focus has been working mostly with young Muslim women, dealing with a variety of issues from mostly focused on depression, anxiety, concerns about our marital issues, pregnancy, postpartum. I'm currently completing my Islamic psychology diploma from Cambridge Muslim College. So my focus has become now incorporating or having an Islamic framework while working with my clients. It's been a very eye-opening experience. I'm not finished with it yet. Inshallah, I graduate in July. So to the question that Brother Ibad asked about, what does contentment, what does a content mind mean? Last time, for those of you that were here, Ustad Yusra had mentioned that, a content heart is what we enters our heart, what we let regarding our heart. A content mind is very similar. It's what thoughts take, place in our mind at all times. So what are we perseverating on, are we focusing on that can potentially, harm our heart as well? From the Islamic perspective, all of it's connected, right? So while, of course, we understand these things are separate, the mind, the aql, the ruh, the spirit, and the heart, they still are all very interconnected. So from the Islamic perspective, it's important for us to be content, not only in the heart, but in our mind. That way we can be better as young Muslims, we can understand what our role is in this life, how we can turn to Allah and be more mindful of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa ala. Ya Rabb, subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. Innaka anta al-alimul hakim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli ba'd. For those of you who may not know me, Mohammad Hasan, originally I started my career as a psychotherapist. I used to run an addiction and mental health clinic in New York City as a clinical director. Did that for a number of years. Eventually ended up in corporate. So I do talent strategy and organizational strategy. That's my 9 to 5. And some of you may know I'm part of the Oak Tree Institute. We are a Muslim leadership advisory group, only one of its kind in the country. Alhamdulillah, I get to work with Muslim communities across the country, advising masajid institutions all over the US. So now to the question, I'm reminded of a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب وله وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this beautiful passage of the Quran, He says that each and every one of us, we must know that this life, and He gives certain stages that all of us go through. And He says that there are parts of our life we're focused on play, parts of our life focused on entertainment. Then we grow older and we focus on beautification. Then we focus on career and advancement, mutual competition, and then eventually about our finances and about our children. All of us in our lives go through these stages. As a teenager, you think, as soon as I can grow up, go to college, my life will be just perfect. My parents will be off my back. I'll be on my own, I can hang out on the campus. And then you go to college and you have difficult professors and you get issues with your academics. And you're like, as soon as I can graduate, get a job, my life will be perfect. And then you graduate. And then, you think, what, if I can find the love of my life and, actually get a job and move up, my life will be perfect. Then you get a job, you get married. Then you say, what, as soon as Allah blesses me with a child, then my life will be perfect. Allah gives you a child. You say, no, my child is only 2 years old, and then maybe when he or she grows a little older and they can be on their own and they stand on their 2 feet, my life will be perfect. And then you grow older and your child becomes older. Now you're a grandparent and you're still worried. The happiness that you are trying to reach, the contentment that you're trying to reach, we never reach it. So, we live in a world we face a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations from our families, expectation just from around us about who we should be, when we should do things, what time we're expected to achieve certain milestones. And you know what's amazing is that we think these things are going to get us happiness. 50%, according to research, 50% of your happiness are purely genetics. Some people are, by genetics, a little more down, a little more sad, and it's just part of your nature. Only 10% are life circumstances. So the jobs that you get, whether you're married, who you marry, those are only 10%. Other 40% is literally your mindset and your thought process. One of the most, the crazy part about our affluent time is that in the midst of affluence and wealth, we have no happiness and contentment. And so when you ask me, what I think about this idea of contentment, of course, as the sister mentioned, subhanAllah, first contentment comes in our longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, at a spiritual level. But then at a level of your minds, it's about the thoughts and the mindset that we hold and the way they impact the way we live our life. Because that's where the 40% of the happiness, contentment, the joy that you can control, that's in your hands.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Hamzah. Some of you might know me as Sayyid, it's my first name. Alhamdulillah, I see some people smiling in the crowd. Appreciate you guys. Alhamdulillah, I finished my residency in psychiatry about 2 years ago now from Columbia University Medical Center and Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in New York. Since then, I've moved back to New Jersey. I work now for a telehealth mental health clinic called Talkiatry, where we provide psychiatric services and also combined medication management and individual therapy for patients. To the question that was posed, it's actually a very common question that I get from patients in the clinic, Muslims included, and quite a few Muslim patients at that. The way I define contentment is that it's reliably reproducible peace of mind, which separates it from, say, happiness or joy as counterexamples. Happiness and joy, I have this discussion with patients all the time because many times I feel like they invest a lot of their actions in chasing happiness and joy, which are fleeting emotions. You can say like they run on a timer, and once that timer fizzles out, there's nothing left of what was before. Whereas contentment is reliably reproducible. It's something that you can go back to many times over. I would also argue that the ultimate contentment comes specifically from learning about Islam. Alhamdulillah, we have an immense blessing that other communities don't have. We have a tremendous advantage in that sense, that Allah has guided us, and I also pray that Allah continues to guide us, myself first included. And I will say that achieving the ultimate contentment in the sense that it becomes reproducible and you can count on it under any sort of circumstance and measure comes from Islam only. And then of course we do other things to help supplement that along the way.
I really appreciate the insight from the speakers. As I mentioned, we have a really stacked panel here. Very excited to go through these questions with them. We're going to get right to it, inshallah. So the questions, we've divided them into 3 parts. The first part is aligning on what are the problems and root causes of the problems. So first we want to define the problems well that afflict us mentally. Second part of the questions will be on what are the barriers to getting better. So even if you understand the problems and you know the root causes, what could prevent you from getting better? And third part will be about how do you correct yourself? How do you fix yourself? So I'm going to jump right into it with the first part on problems and root causes. Sister Sania, I have a question for you. Since you do a lot of therapy with sisters and with female patients, what are the most common mental health issues that you see with your clients?
So, in my practice, like I mentioned before, most of my clients, if not all, are young Muslim women. The two most common topics that I see are anxiety and depression. Many are struggling with, finding fulfillment in life. What Brother Mohammad had mentioned, wanting to go to the next thing, feeling depressed, maybe if they're not getting the career that they want, or if they are unable to or having struggle getting married. So a lot of this, comes down to it, and then they end up coming to therapy because they're not finding fulfillment, and they are more anxious and depressed. And then with that topic comes marital concerns as well, concerns with in-laws, not being prepared, unrealistic expectations, and then eventually pregnancy postpartum. Another most common issue that I see is really working with mothers, right? Mothers who are being challenged in parenting and emotional regulation. So potentially, not being able to control their anger or control their emotions while parenting. This is probably the biggest thing that I see, and a lot of guilt coming from that. So then coming into therapy, understanding about how can I first regulate my own emotions so I can be okay for myself and then be okay for my children as well. So those are the most common concerns that I see when working with young Muslim women.
This panel is definitely biased towards me. They gave me the biggest couch. And the sister and brother here, they're not taking the full time, but I will. So, alhamdulillah. First of all, jazakallah khair for having us here. My wife and I, we moved recently to New Jersey every year now, so had the chance to attend one or two Sabil events as well. So really good to have space for our age, mashallah. So in between our travels, when we get the chance, we try to be part of this community, alhamdulillah. As far as the common mental health challenges, I think you're going to ask me about for the brother side. I obviously didn't focus on my practice just on males, but I ran a clinic, so I saw the whole 9 yards, all age groups, all genders. Let's step back a little bit. Let me ask you this question: what is the percentage of the population in the U.S. that you think deals with mental health illness? What do you say, 100%? No, the answer is actually 60 million, around 60 million. That's, to give you a perspective, that's the size of the entire population of Italy. So 60%, 60 million, that's about 1/4 of the population. And that holds true for also the Muslim population. And so if you ask me, what are some of the challenges that the Muslim brothers have when it comes to mental illness, is similar to, as Sania mentioned actually, depression, anxiety, and addiction is the top 3. But let me actually give you another perspective. Some of the factors that I feel that are contributing, of course, our Dr. Saab here will talk about the genetics and other elements, but there are some social factors that are new in our time and place. And I like to categorize them into 4. Number 1, there is a change in gender role. Now, none of these are good or bad, but these have an impact on how the brothers are experiencing depression, anxiety, and addiction. Change in gender role. A telltale sign of that during the marriage process, most brothers, for many years, they had privilege where they didn't have to worry about the 200 questions. Right? The sister will come with 200 questions, and the brother will be like, yes, let's just talk about them quickly, because they assume that after marriage, I can just work it out. Right? But come find out, no, there is a change in gender role, and the sister is saying she's not going to move, she's not going to move. And you come to this realization that the world is changing around you. And so the brothers, they haven't fully made that switch in what they expect, what they feel about themselves. So that's number 1. Number 2, there is a lack of strong father figures in the house, especially among the Arab. I could just speak as a Desi person, and out of families that I know, a lot of our mothers are frustrated with our fathers because they're not playing an active role. But their own behavior has castrated their role in the house. And so a lot of our young men don't grow up with strong and quality father figures in the house. Number three is hypersexuality. That in the era that we live in, just the advent of pornography, a person within 10 minutes can see more naked bodies than their forefathers have seen their entire life. And so that level of hypersexuality, I call it sexual, you have obesity, sexual obesity. The amount of consumption of that material, it starts to cause all sorts of issues in your minds, in your mindset, and it is a factor. And the last one, I would say number 4, is in our modern world, workism, right? This pressure that your work identity literally is equated with your own personal identity, especially it's true for the brothers. Right? I went to Hajj, and we're doing a little ta'aruf, just getting to know one another. When we went around and said, tell me a little bit about yourself, what do you want to share with each other? the first thing people said is, I'm a physician, I work in IT, I'm an accountant. Our identity is connected with our work. And I could tell you, I work in corporate and I do design of talent. I can tell you there's an orchestrated effort to make sure that you stay at work longer, you're connected, you have work families, you have safe space at work. And so a brother, especially for a young man who's maybe struggling in college or have struggled through their careers, they feel less of a man, because their whole identity is connected. And of course we know they have to be able to afford the family, they pay the bills. Of course that's true. But that work identity and equating with your own self-worth is another of those four of the key factors that are impacting, I think, young men like ourselves in this era.
Mohammad and Sania for talking about some of the issues. So we talked about depression, we talked about anxiety, on some of the problems that are common for our age demographic. So the question for you, Hamzah, is about what are the root causes for these issues? And now that we know these issues, how much of these are actually beyond our control? They're just genetic, like we can't do anything about them.
So to begin, in medicine, or specifically in psychiatry, we use what's called the biopsychosocial model for evaluation. So it's basically a template that can be used to try to integrate enough information about a given person to try to come up with an explanation for what their behavioral patterns are, what's brought them to this point in life, what experiences have had significant impacts on them. If you take a look at each category, bio is for biological, so that refers to, say, your age, your gender, your genetic composition, physical health conditions, specifically even the neurochemical makeup of the brain, which is more pointedly what's related to psychiatric discussions. It's basically like how the brain makes use of neurochemicals that it has available to it. I'll get into that a little bit later perhaps in terms of determining how we treat things like depression, anxiety, OCD at the micro level. And that's the role that medications have to play. The social aspect, essentially you can boil it down to say it's related to one's belief system. Now, your belief system is so core to your center, and alhamdulillah we have Islam for that, that it serves as a basis for your expectations from day to day. So when you wake up in the morning, your belief system, whatever it may be, paints what you expect to see at different points of the day and how you react to either meeting your expectations or missing your expectations. And I'll circle back to that a little bit later as well. The third component is the social component, which is related to your interpersonal relationships, so the quality of connections that you have with people around you, your social support system, so who you can count on in dire moments, your socioeconomics, so that would be like where you grew up, what your environment was like when you were growing up, what impact those standards and norms had on you as you were growing up, especially during your formative years, which are like largely your early childhood, early adolescence into young adulthood. Now, basically that's like a 3-category breakdown of the form of evaluation that we use. Now, if you have deficiencies in any given area of the above 3, then that produces distress. Now, the next question is, how does one manage the distress that results from deficiencies in these categories? If you're very adaptive, which is like the word we use, it's the opposite of the word maladaptive, which is like, say, when you make either consciously or unconsciously bad choices about how to cope with stress. If that occurs, then this distress builds up to the point that it can serve as a trigger for underlying mental health conditions. I would say most commonly, the hot topic ones today are depression, anxiety, OCD, social anxiety, and bipolar disorder to some degree. It's rarer than the other conditions, so to speak. Now, sort of the next logical question from that is, how do we determine the presence of an underlying mental health condition, right? How do we know that it's depression? How do we know that it's anxiety, OCD, so on and so forth? I'll touch on that maybe in greater detail a little bit later, but just as a sort of preview, one has to have a set of symptoms that meet what we call diagnostic criteria. So basically, you have to have a certain number of symptoms that fit a specific timeline to meet a diagnosis. Now, sort of at the micro level, I would say like a lot of the common discussion is around a neurotransmitter called serotonin. Have you guys heard of that? Yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's sort of like the poster boy for brain chemistry, you can say. Now, most people, I think, have this idea that basically if you're depressed, your serotonin levels are low, correct? That's not right. So basically that's a common misconception and sort of like a red herring, right? So if you look at the way medications work, is essentially what they do is they optimize the brain's use of the neurotransmitters that are available to it. So it's not necessarily that you're missing serotonin, but your brain doesn't make a good enough use of it. And that's where, say, for example, medications can come into play. There's an excellent lecture that I'll add to by Yasser Qadi, where he has it's a pretty lengthy lecture, but very, very useful. I recommend it, where he explains that basically using something like medication is not at odds with pursuing your improvement as a Muslim. It doesn't conflict with, say, for example, your development of Iman. You can say that these things are actually interrelated. And in some sense, if you're making a smart choice for your health, you're setting yourself up for to build your Iman even further in the future, for example.
That was the first part. On problems and root causes. So we're going to jump to the second part, which is on barriers to getting better. So Sister Sania, first question I wanted to ask you, which is on cultural stigma as a barrier, which is a very common barrier for a lot of us. And Hamzah was kind of just touching on it a little bit. So how does cultural stigma impact the willingness of our demographic from actually getting help?
So this question, I'm sure you guys can all answer this as well. But what I've seen, at least in my work and in our community, is that there's a couple of reasons that kind of prevent people from coming to therapy. One of the main reasons that I see is a cultural stigma is bringing shame onto the family, right? Or feeling like, I'm not good enough and I have to go to therapy. A lot of people will assume the community will find out. This person's from our community, they're gonna tell everyone about my family problems or my issues. And I reassured a lot of clients that, we have, just like doctors, we have something called HIPAA, which is very strong in not revealing any of the information. But that's a pretty big one that I see that maybe be obvious, but for many people do struggle with trusting sometimes therapists, especially if they're within the same community as you. Another issue is, that your therapist, since they're Muslim, they're going to judge you, right? Like, I don't want to tell my therapist that, what I've been going through, or if I have been praying or not been praying, or what struggles I've been having, because they're going to judge me, because they're Muslim as well. But this is further from the truth. For the most part, Muslim therapists are here to understand and to have a background from before. Because I will guarantee you, when you go to a non-Muslim therapist, and it's not saying that you can't, but it becomes more challenging, right, to explain all the cultural nuances, all the religious nuances that come from within the faith. And it's easier to have someone who's at least familiar with it or experiencing it, because they're able to relate better, right? They're able to understand where you're coming from. And the last one is really, feeling like if you're depressed, or if you're having anxiety, that you are a bad Muslim, or you have, which we kind of touched upon, having low iman, right? So that's something that we'll talk more about, but like really briefly, about how the Prophet ﷺ, when he lost his wife Khadija and his uncle that year, what was that year called? Year of the grief, right? Year of sadness. So it shows that the Prophet ﷺ also felt deep emotions, right? And we do as well. So feeling sadness, feeling grief, feeling down does not mean that we are bad Muslim or have bad iman. It just means that we are struggling with something. It may just need extra assistance.
So, actually, going on that last step, you have to actually some mic off.
It's a whole process.
Unfortunately, the way the mic's like is they've got to shut it off, and then I got to turn mine on, something. So Mohammad, just like continuing pulling on the thread, Sister Sania was kind of talking about this a little bit in terms of like understanding of religiosity and how that relates to seeking help for seeking help if you have some kind of mental issue. So I wanted to ask you, what kind of misunderstandings do people have about religiosity, And how does that bar them from getting help?
Now, that's a very loaded question. I'll try to do it justice in a few minutes, inshallah. There are a number of them. For our purposes tonight, I'm thinking of just few. Firstly, that as a Muslim, we don't believe in mental health, or we don't believe in mental illness, right? As our brother mentioned here, that clearly there are neurological and biological evidences for the disease. So we know it is a disease. I mean, in all the communities that I've visited, I mean, you know this, I don't have to tell you. I could tell you, people that I know. I mean, talking about the brothers, I mean, a 32-year-old brother, father of two children, dealing with PTSD, right? Because he was molested as a teenager by his cousin, male cousin. These are people in our communities, right? Or a 29-year-old entrepreneur that I know that is addicted to pornography and dealing with this addiction, went to Hajj, made so much istighfar, trying his best, but this is what they're facing with, or individuals who are dealing with depression, bipolar. These are individuals, and as Sania mentioned about the shame and guilt. I specialize in working with imams and Muslim leadership, and so I actually have imams and leaders who are my clients. And I can tell you, first thing I say, Sheikh, I respect you with all, and you are much better of a person than I am, but I can be of some help. Because you're dealing with some things. And so, so number one is that we do know that this is a disease. So we know that. But then number two, it becomes, it must be because of jinn or ayn or hasad or something. Because it's easy to blame the shaitan than to say that there's something wrong with me. If I ask you, how many of you deal with diabetes? And if you do, you probably wouldn't be as reluctant to say, yeah, I have type 2 diabetes. But if I ask you, how many of you have depression? Because by the stats, 1/4 of you sitting here have mental illness. But you wouldn't raise your hand because of all the shame and guilt, right? And so every single scholar that I have consulted, they have said, whenever someone is showing a symptom, first thing you check is, do they have any kind of physical ailments? Then you check whether or not they have a mental ailment. Then we can say maybe there is a ayn or a hasad or a sihr or some sort of a jinn issue, right? Number three, I think, is that if one of the misconception myth that we have in the community, especially from a religious perspective, is that something must be wrong with my iman, right? And we conflate the soul and the body and the mind. Subhanallah, if you pray a lot of salah, right, but you don't study for your exam, it's not going to help you much, right? Or other way around, if you work out your legs very well, but you have no spiritual motivation, you're not going to be able to stand for Taraweeh. Mind and body are separate, but they're interconnected, right? And so knowing that, your taqwa is in your spiritual heart, but anxiety is in your physical brain. That your depression is in your body, right? And your iman is in your ruh. And so being able to distinguish those things is quite important. And it's sad that Muslims are one of the first. In the 8th century Baghdad, we have reports of Muslims being the first to ever start up psychiatric hospitals. While the Europeans were in the medieval ages, where they thought demons were the cause of all mental ailments, right? Ibn Sina and Razi and so forth. And lastly, I would say, as my time trickles away, because there's so much, I could sit here for another 2 hours and talk to you about this. But to wrap it up, number 4, I would say is that, in the same vein, that if I have a mental illness, if I have some sort of a issue that I'm dealing with, it's probably because I need to pray more or make more dua. And subhanAllah, that's such a misunderstanding of our deen. That Rasulullah taught us dua for our stomach pain. He's taught us dua for our depression, yes. Allahumma inna a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal hazan, yes, of course. But how many of you make the dua for the stomach and don't go to a doctor? Right? And so we do us a disservice when we say that just make more dua. And I know a brother who was going through actually bipolar disorder, and some brothers, they say, you know what, you don't need all that therapy. Just come to us to our dojo. We'll do some Khabib style, martial arts, and take vitamin B12, B6, and omega-3 fatty acids, and work it out, but tough it out. And guess what? He had a manic episode. This is a dangerous type of thing that we do. We think that we can just somehow walk it off, or pray more, pray more salah, or make more dua. That is not our deen. In fact, I'll leave you with this. even in the 7th, 8th century, and you could look him up, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, one of the earliest scholars, he grew up in Khorasan, he practiced in Baghdad, was a tafsir scholar actually. One of the first to write about cognitive behavioral therapy. It is in our deen that we understand that there is a ailment that are related to the mind, that are separate from the spiritual ailments, and that are separate from the physical ailments. And I think once we start to recognize that and reconcile that, and of course, Islam gives us the best foundation for our well-being, of course. In no other spiritual mindset, philosophy is going to give you a better well-being mindset. But then when it comes to actual ailments and diseases, you got to seek the treatment. As he said, that for every disease, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also created the cure, right? And so the mercy of Allah is in the knife of the surgeon. And so knowing that these are sort of some of the barriers that we have, and inshallah later on maybe I'll touch upon some of the, especially now that mental health is a lot more popular in the Muslim community. We have a lot of young therapists that are out doing private practice. I have a lot of thoughts about that. I used to run a clinic. I train a lot of therapists, but I think we'll talk about that, about the really supercharging that they do and amount of their charging arm and a leg for therapy. I'll talk more about that inshallah, but those are also all barriers in our community as to why people are unable to seek treatment.
All right, so Jazakallah khair, Brother Mohammad. So we're going to go to the last question of this section for Hamzah. So we talked about culture being a barrier. We talked about this impression of what religiosity really is being a barrier. The third barrier that I want, Hamzah, if you could speak to a little bit, is about knowledge. So some of us, we're past the barriers of culture, we're ready to go, but we don't know when to go. How do you know it's time for you to go see a professional? For those of us in the room who are non-experts. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so this is an excellent question, and I think very, very common and perhaps difficult to ask sometimes out loud. Now, the way I like to look at it is essentially, in medicine we use what are called clinical scales. They're basically tools that doctors use to assign numerical values, you could say, to someone's experience or symptoms, okay? So I'm gonna point out a couple of different clinical scales, and anybody who wants to jot them down, it's an easy way. It's basically just like a quick Google. You'll be able to find each of them and even to some degree, test yourself out. Now, you don't want to take a scale and then come with a diagnosis yourself, right? What you want to do is combine that with an evaluation from a professional, right? But it does give you an idea or sense of direction about when to seek help professionally. So I'm going to list out a couple of them. So there's one called the PHQ-9. Which is a clinical scale for depression. There's the GAD-7, which is a clinical scale for generalized anxiety. And there's the OCI-4. That's the last one I'll mention. That's for obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms. Now, basically, you can use any of these tests. It's very simple. There's a website called MDCalc, C-A-L-C, for example, as in calculator. You can just Google that. It's an easy way to get access to the scales and then almost test yourself out to see what you score. And there's also an interpretation for the score available with the scales. Now, basically, what I would say in addition to that is, let's say you score a particular number that alarms you to some degree. You want to seek out professional help because it circles back to what I talked about in the first section, which is that you want someone who can use a biopsychosocial evaluation to integrate that information so that you get what's called a formulation, which is basically you can say a giant snapshot of someone's case. Now, sort of the next thing that I try to advise is if you can get an evaluation from a Muslim clinician, I think there's tremendous value in that. I can't tell you how many times I've had Muslim patients come to me and say they felt a sense of relief from not having to over-explain themselves about certain things. And of course, as a clinician, you want to help dig out some of those details yourself. But at the same time, there's a sense of camaraderie, I think, that comes from patients and being able to speak to someone who maybe understands things on a level that perhaps a non-Muslim would not be able to speak to or understand subtly. The third part that I'll comment on as well is access to care. I think that was part of the question, or a hidden part of the question, right? Yeah. So I'll say this too, that sometimes it can be difficult to get access to care easily. I always advise, what you really want to do is the homework is to determine which clinics might accept, for example, insurance plans. it's not always that easy. A lot of, I would say a lot of modern clinics are cash-only practices, so you want to be very particular about that. I mean, I would say my clinic, for example, takes pretty much all major insurances. So you want to find a clinic like that. That's going to make the process easy for you. I would also say you would want to take a look and see what type of management you're interested in. So for instance, you can say the gold standard of care for treating, for example, major depression, generalized anxiety, OCD, these conditions is what we call combined management. So that's medication management plus individualized therapy. So you follow consistently with a therapist, and then you also have a physician who's monitoring your medications. Now, is there some degree of flexibility between these things? Of course there is. So that's why you want to have a professional evaluation to determine, okay, is it possible to maybe start with some degree of therapy and then move on to medications? Is it more suitable to start with medications straight away, which is often the case. But I would say what you really want to focus on is being able to accurately say, okay, like this is a good time for me maybe to seek more professional help. And I would say this as well, it's not going to hurt to keep the bar on the lower side versus the higher side. You can always talk to your clinician and say, okay, maybe this isn't the exact time for you, but at the same time, you're going to get a professional evaluation which will help guide your choice.
Jazakallah khair, Hamzah. So we're getting to the final part, inshallah. We just have about 10 minutes until Maghrib. So we're going to try to go through as much as we can. If we can't, we'll continue after the prayer, inshallah. So Sister Sania, the next question is for you in this third part, which is about corrective actions. So we've talked about problems and root causes. We've talked about what could prevent someone from getting better. And now it's how do we correct ourselves? How do we fix it? So the question that I want to ask you is, especially related to you're studying this right now, is how does the framework of Islam help someone to develop a content mind?
So this is also a loaded question that we could talk about for hours, but I'll try to summarize it in a couple minutes. So the framework of Islam, the beautiful thing about our religion is that it has the answers, right? Our book, the Quran, is a timeless book that's meant to be as a guide forever. And while a lot of this is much more surfacey and mental health is a spectrum, right? So we can talk about, having a content mind is one who has also a content heart and is mindful of Allah, right? But if someone is struggling with very severe psychiatric disorders, it may be hard to get. That's not what you're going to start with, right? We're going to start with more med management, more understanding the symptoms. But eventually it is to focus on how does our mind, how our thoughts impact our heart. So our aql is really the key to raising the heart to a higher level, to be able to understand that a Muslim is one who truly submits to Allah. Like Brother Mohammad had mentioned, this is already a part of our tradition. Balhi was doing this work, much before we heard about Freud and all the other kind of modern psychologists and psychotherapists, that this is already in our tradition, that we were discussing that, a part of getting better, getting treatment in our tradition is not just about physical health, but it's about mental health as well. And it's all together that we get treatment. And the Prophet ﷺ said, if there's something wrong, there's an illness, you get treatment for it. And that also applies to mental health. Having a content mind is the goal, but understanding that if you don't feel content, or if you are struggling with this, does not mean that you are, again, a bad Muslim, right? It does not mean that sometimes some days will be better, some days will be worse. It means that it is part of the struggle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we will be tested, we will have trials, and for many of us, that includes mental illnesses, mental health struggles, anxiety, depression. So when we change our framework to about more a content mind, understanding like this is the trial that Allah has given us, then it helps us face that trial with more hope, right? Just like the Prophet ﷺ faced many, many trials in his life. Turning to the Quran, to the stories of the prophets, right? For many people struggling with, maybe questioning their families, why did they get such a challenge of having a difficult family? We look to the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, right? So a lot of our struggles can be found in the Quran and in the prophetic tradition. Before I pass the mic, some quick advice and some quick tips, right, is looking at, our role model, Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How did he have a content mind, even though he was struggling with many things, like losing his wife, losing his uncle, and many of the struggles that he faced, rejection from his community and so on, there's some practical tips that we can kind of follow that help us, on a day-to-day basis that I work on with my clients. We had mentioned one is not just reading the Quran, but reflecting and contemplating on the ayat, like I kind of said, about looking at the different stories of the prophets, right? Understanding how can that help us in what we're kind of struggling with. A few of the things are slowing down, focusing where we are in the moment, being mindful. One thing that didn't come up was social media, right? So like kind of realizing how much social media has impacted our contentment. We look at everything online and we're like, oh, I wish we had this, I wish we had that. Everything looks perfect on the screen. So kind of slowing down and being mindful and being present in the moment without, our screens. And the last two things are really just, having good company, right? Which is kind of why we're here today. We're having good Sohbah community, which we're very blessed with here in these many masajids, is being able to have others and having good company to rely on them to have that content mind. And lastly is one of the things I've been working on a lot is like being in service of others, right? And sometimes when we feel lost or confused, it is a great way to kind of give us some sense of purpose in life. So these are some very basic practical tips that are from the Islamic framework, and then inshallah I'll pass it on to Brother Mohammad.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Sania. So for putting the perspective in terms of broadly framework of Islam. So Hamzah, what I want to ask you is actually a little more specific. So we talked broad framework of Islam. My question for you is, what are some specific therapeutic techniques that you recommend for someone to help cope?
All right, Jazakallah khair. Yeah, so I'm going to divide this answer up into like basically two components. The first one is I'm going to take a little bit to comment on different types of therapy, because I think most people have sort of like a blanket idea of what therapy is. It's like, I think their vision is that they go in, they sit across from someone, you talk about something, or you sort of like dump your feelings, and then maybe the person across from you is, hopefully listening closely, and then giving you some sort of feedback, and then there's a back and forth. Now, in reality, there's many different types of therapy, and I want to take a moment to sort of just delve into a couple of them, a couple of the major modalities, because I find that there's a lot of benefit when patients even feel drawn to a particular kind of therapy, because it opens the discussion with, say, like their psychiatrist or their therapist in an easy way. So for instance, one, you can say like a couple of the major ones are CBT, DBT, psychodynamic, and supportive. So I'll just do a quick sort of overview of each of these. So CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And basically you can boil this down to say that the idea behind it in a simplified way is to be able to practice enough to be able to challenge what's called automatic thinking, which is essentially, you can say like over many, many years, our brains develop, you could say algorithms based on our experiences and what's happened to us and how we've reacted to them in the past. And basically at a certain point, your brain starts to almost churn out responses. And if you're not very cognizant of that, then you're essentially playing catch up to what your brain is outputting as opposed to being in the driver's seat. So that's an example. That's the first example, is a very major type of therapy. There's DBT, what's called dialectical behavioral therapy. So I like to bring this one up in particular because I think sometimes it's sort of pigeonholed or associated with a very specific type of diagnosis in psychiatry. That's borderline personality disorder. Now, is it effective for borderline personality disorder? Absolutely. It was developed by Marsha Linehan. She was a psychologist who self-diagnosed with BPD and then made a workbook based on that. But essentially, there are so many useful gems and tools from that I think that can be applied very broadly. You don't have to wait until you have a BPD diagnosis to benefit. And essentially what that boils down to is what we call responding to and controlling emotional dysregulation. I think the brother mentioned emotional regulation earlier as well. And it's basically, you can say that like our emotions, to use a kind of analog or a metaphor, they exist on a type of scale. Now, for some folks, that scale is very volatile. So it's very difficult for them to be able to, say, go from like 0 to 30 when something difficult comes their way. They tend to go from like 0 to 70 or 0 to 80. So the therapy is based on maybe calibrating some of that. The third type I was going to comment on is what's called psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is essentially very, very old style of therapy. You can say it's like old school Freudian, Jungian stuff. And it's basically based on the idea of putting together a kind of like giant portrait of someone based on their childhood behaviors. So it's like very, very deep dive therapy. And then there's supportive psychotherapy, which is, in a simplified way, I might describe that as having a thought partner or someone you're able to sit across from, get your emotions out, get your feelings out, and then to be able to say, collaborate on what might be like useful mechanisms for you to use to get better. Now, having said all of that, I want to integrate an Islamic concept that I think is very, very important. You can say there's an English expression that goes, comparison is the thief of joy. And I think all of us find ourselves doing that. I see so many head nods, so I'm going to take that as a yes. And you can say that as a community, I think it's sapping us of a lot of energy and well-being. Now, well before this expression came into being, the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Muslim, he advised us to look at those below us and not above us, lest we belittle the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows upon us. So the Prophet ﷺ, you can say, advised this well in advance of the expression coming into existence. So, and we want to follow the prophetic example. So it's very, very important to say, like, keep track of how you're doing in terms of like making these comparisons. If you want something that someone else has, for example, that in and of itself is not bad if it doesn't become hasad. For example, one can make dua because Allah Azza wa Jalla is always in charge of one's rizq and provisions. So that can be a healthy way to say, for example, work towards something that you do want. But we want to follow the prophetic example for that. And keeping these things in mind is very, very important, I would say, especially in the social media age.
Hamzah, we do have one more question, but we're pretty much at time for Maghrib. So what we're going to do is we'll break. We will break for Maghrib at the masjid. We'll come back here, inshallah. Program will start again at 9:10 sharp, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So I just wanted to actually comment on a few things very quickly as we close out this section. We talked about some of the therapy modalities. I think few areas that are important for me to mention that are relevant for us. Number one is marriage therapy, and I think some folks here are interested in that. The few quick, just practical advice that I will give you is that most people seek marriage therapy very late in the game. Most people are seeing therapists in the 50th year of their marriage, and most people get divorced in the 6th year. So it is the reality. The challenge with marriage therapy is that most people, they go to a therapist for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and then they feel that, I'm done, I'm good. Other challenge is you have piled of issues for years, and you get a little glimpse for a session, and then you're off again fighting at home, and then again another session. So I have some theories on what I believe the marriage modality, therapy modality needs to change, but that's a different discussion for a different time. The second area that we didn't quite address is addiction. A lot of people, and I used to run a clinic that had a full addiction practice. We had about 250 patients on a weekly basis, and so over 14 therapists and clinicians and psychiatrists. So I'll tell you is that a lot of people in the Muslim community, and I have people in the community, who I have, many years ago, almost a decade ago, I used to be youth director of a masjid, and I was involved in the whole 9 yards. And I have driven young brothers to rehab myself, and then prayed their janazah a few weeks later, right? And so this is real stuff. I was in Dallas just a few weeks ago, and Michigan right after that. And I'll tell you one of the biggest things most imams and masjid are asking about is about addiction, is about rehab. This is top of mind for most people. And so do realize that treatment and therapy for addiction is very different, or at least somewhat different than treatment for anxiety and depression. You might have dual diagnosis, but it's different. Different why? Part of addiction therapy is actually group therapy. Because it's important not just talk to a therapist. I know people who had individual therapists for years and never addressed their addiction. And because you need to be in a group setting where there's accountability, where people are challenging you. I had a client who told me, like, what is all this me talking to random people in a circle going to do for me? I said, this talking with random people about your issues is your antibiotics. Like that itself is what you need, right? And so that's number 3. And the last one we didn't address is same-sex feelings. This is common in our community. It's real. I'm sorry to be very, very blunt. We know that ethically, none of us therapists can do conversion therapy. That is not ethically, legally allowed. However, you can address the underlying issues, whether it be insecurities, whether it be a strong mother figure in the house, whether it be other depression or eating disorders or even sexual traumas. There are other factors, and sometimes it's just purely genetics. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests certain people different ways, but there are things you can address with your therapist. There are things you can go for without even needing to, not to have these feelings anymore or fully be converted into someone who doesn't have these same-sex feelings anymore. That's not always a reality. So I did want to bring those few points out. I think it is quite important. Okay, I only have a minute left. So on this issue of how do we develop this mindset of contentment, I'll just tell you few quick things. Number one, we all know about gratitude, but gratitude is not just about counting your blessings. Of course, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He tells us in the Quran that if you are grateful, Allah will increase you. Right, and so la in shakartum la azidannakum. Right, Allah, the more grateful you are, Allah will increase you. But that gratitude has to be in few areas. That gratitude has to be not just you counting blessings, but also you being around people who are very much gratitude focused. Sometimes we're around people who are constantly thinking about what they don't have. Right, and so that gratitude has to transform into the people that we're around. That gratitude has to transform in the way we say things. As we know in the famous incident, Rasulullah lost his son Ibrahim. He said, my eyes will shed tears, but I will not say things that will be disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so a lot of us, we sometimes over-exaggerate. In the English language, there are 3,000 words for emotions. We typically use just 10. Mad, sad, glad, upset, and that's it, right? And we might be experiencing a lot more nuanced life event. And so it's important for us to, when we even express, are we saying things that are ungrateful? Right? It's okay to express sadness. It's okay to express certain feelings. And by the way, certain people are normally more melancholy than others. Right? Bittersweet. If you read that book, some people are not everybody has to be upbeat and positive all the time. That is not nature of human beings. Some people are more extroverted. Some more introverted. It's normal. I think we have criminalized and pathologized people who are a little bit down, not always excited and energetic. That's just not reality. Many people are not that way. So number one is that gratitude has to be real. Number two is really mindfulness. And when I say mindfulness, or as we know in the famous incident when a man came and prayed salah at the Masjid of Prophet ﷺ, and Rasulullah taught him to have tama'nina in the salah, to have that tranquility, that when you're on your ruku, enjoy your ruku. When you're sujood, enjoy your sujood. That translates to the rest of our life. We're at work thinking about home. We're at home thinking about hanging out with the guys. We're constantly just not in the moment. Right? That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran points to different celestial beings and said, ponder on that. The other thing I will point out though, there is a seeping disease that's from the self-help and self-care that's seeping into our Muslim ideology. So it's true that you have to have mindfulness and you should be mindful about eating, mindful and take a deep breath and center yourself. But we have to be careful with that. Because sometimes we have Muslim therapists and people in the self-help industry that will just say these things without really thinking through. You cannot center yourself with yourself. The only centering force is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there is a little bit of aqidah issue when you say something like, I'm just centering on my body and my centering on my soul. That is not appropriate, right? We do center, and we are also mindful, not just being mindful of my food, how it enters my mouth. I'm mindful and I'm grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that risk. Same practice, I'm just asking you to make a slight shift in the way you approach it. And it's quite important, and so that mindfulness is very important. And lastly, it's not just about mindset, feeling good and making shifts in the way we do things. It's also about your service, right? And one of the biggest ways you can instill contentment in your life is if you are in the business of khidmah of other people. If you're in the business of serving others, not because you are a type 2 in your Enneagram and you are very much about pleasing people, not that. I'm saying that you are focused on the khidmah. Especially I'll speak to us young men here, being able to develop that mindset of khidmah and the attitude of khidmah, being of service to people, that will really help you to develop that mindset. There are research on this, on how your action has a whole lot of impact on your contentment. And so if we can practice that gratitude in our action, if we can practice that mindfulness that is holistic, and if we can practice, inshallah, these things will help us, inshallah, to have contentment in our lives.
Mohammad. So this ends the portion of the panel where we're going through specific parts with regards to contentment of the mind. So we have several questions that were asked through the Slido. So make sure that even if you don't have a question, check out the Slido, upvote whatever you think is relevant for you, because we're just going to go in the order of what most people want to hear. So the first question that we've got, and I'll ask the question, and I'll leave it open to speakers, whoever wants to address the question. If more than one person wants to, you're welcome to. Unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of time. Try to stick to the time on the clock. This way everyone has a chance to speak. So the question is, what is the best way to develop focus and avoid distractions? How do we discipline ourselves? So if anyone wants to, you're welcome to volunteer. This one had 7 votes. There are 7 people in this audience that are anxiously waiting to hear the answer to this question.
So one of the ways to kind of develop focus, I think, first I'll start with why maybe we don't have focus, and it just goes back to our phones, right? So in the digital age, it's really hard to put our phones down, right? They're always beeping, our Apple Watches, everything's always clicking. So one of my suggestions for the first thing is to limit our screen time, to develop more focus and be, like Brother Mohammad said, being mindful and present in the things that we are doing. So whether that's setting limits on social media apps, right? Looking at your screen time, actively decreasing it every day. I think that's probably my suggestion to increase the focus in other parts of your life. Our phones are very fast-paced, right? Like TikTok, Instagram, Reels, everything is moving really fast. So we get bored really easily, right? And this is even happening with kids with screen time, which is a whole different topic. But in terms of, for as adults, I think kind of putting our phones away and really being present in the moment and decreasing screen time and just taking our time to do what we do is probably my suggestion for focus, if anyone else add.
Barring you having ADHD, and I'll leave our doctor to talk more about that, and not because you're in medical school and you're trying to study with Adderall, but just generally speaking, barring that, I would suggest add 2 things. One is, we have fried our dopamine system quite a bit in the very busy world that we live in. Constant gratification, and so things that supposed to, the reward circuitry in our brain are all fried for a lot of us, right? Without constant gratification, we can't stay in one thing. The other thing is you might be just tired. You might be just exhausted. You have small children and you're doing a lot, and we have so much pressure on us that we think I'm supposed to be at 100% at all time. That is not realistic. Like, your body needs a break, your mind needs a break, your creativity needs a break. And so it's quite important to make sure you're having those various types of breaks in your life. And lastly, it might be a task that you're not actually passionate about. Let's be honest with yourself. You can't really focus, and you've been trying to do this project or this thing. It's really deep down, you're not passionate about it. And so if you're not passionate about it, you're not going to find that inner motivation and to do that task.
And the one point I'll add as well is that when it comes to, say, like these social media apps and so on and so forth, like, say, TikTok, Instagram, they're by design intended to get you to continue scrolling, right? So, for example, you can say that they hire specialists to be able to devise ways to get you to continue. And it's sort of a classic, like, just 5 more minutes before going to bed or something, and that eventually turns into an hour. And the other thing I might advise in regards to that too is certainly, like, setting time limits for the specific use of, like, say, apps that you use on your phone, how much time you spend on a screen, like Sister Sania was mentioning, and to keep in mind as well that, to some degree it's like a predatory behavior behind, like, the apps, right? So they know that you're going to keep diving deeper down the rabbit hole, and this is eventually going to, you can say, like, it's almost like there's something endemic about it, as in, like, you send a video to someone, they spread the video to someone else. Eventually, it's like a web that's being created, and everybody is being caught in it. So.
Someone you have no idea, and 2 families, 2 teams supposed to work together, and they've never actually met. Very interesting project. But when do you know? Honestly, there is no blood test I could give you, and there isn't on the DSM-5. Is there a criteria for marriage? No, there isn't. There is DSM criteria for depression, anxiety, and all other illnesses. But this is when you know that you will know. I mean, when do you know? I think you're probably asking because you believe that you need to. The person's probably asking because you believe you need to be in therapy, and your spouse probably doesn't agree. And so you're trying to find certain evidence as to why you should be, going, and that's probably a telltale sign that it's probably a good idea to seek some help. But and also it's really about whether or not you start to realize that, and I could probably go on, but I'll tell you just a few things I have seen in my experience, and so Sania, you can add a few more. Is when you realize that you have lost respect for the person, and then you're operating as just roommates. You're probably very far in the process. When you realize that small issues are becoming big arguments, and they stay like that for days, right? SubhanAllah, we know that Prophet said that if you're angry, you should lie down, or sit down. If you sit down, lie down. But tell that to a married couple, they can have fights lying down as well. So the point is, we're seeing that small arguments are becoming big issues, and they're staying like that for a while. And thirdly, I would say there's a complex issue. One of your child was diagnosed with something, and there is a big issue with the in-laws. There is a big financial issue. So in a big crisis like that, seeking some third-party, arbitrator or help, can be very useful.
All right, next question is, it's a pretty personal question, I guess. Question is, how do you yourselves, like in all caps, handle or deal with stress? Any tips or pointers?
It's a loaded question. So as a therapist, personally, one of the first things I did in my 20s, actually, I went to therapy myself. Because in order to be there for others, to be a therapist to others, I had to work through all my own struggles. So that was the first step that I kind of took in terms of taking care of myself. That doesn't mean everyone needs to go to therapy, but I think it can be very beneficial, especially if many of us are, first-generation immigrants. It can be very beneficial. Currently now in my phase of life, I think majority of it is being mindful and taking care of myself, and not in the self-care way of the Western, of like spa, pedicure, manicure, not like that, but actually taking care of myself. So taking the time to work out, taking the time to eat good, eat healthy, right? Taking the time to spend time with my family and also spiritually. So I think those are the few ways that I take time for myself. I don't think I mentioned, but I have 3 young kids at home, alhamdulillah, so that kind of prompted me a lot, because most of my day is taken up by taking care of the kids. So for me, it was very important to make sure I have those few hours to myself, whether it's going for a walk outside in nature, whether it's working out, eating healthy, or even just getting out of the house to just see a friend, and just have that time to myself. So really being mindful of how I'm doing that, and making sure I'm taking care of myself in relation to, again, how we mentioned, being mindful of Allah and taking care of all the blessings that He has given.
Very quickly, I'm glad you asked that question, because last thing we want is for you to feel like, these are people up here that have conquered life and they have no stress, and I don't. I'm kidding. No, that's not true. We are all in our own process, alhamdulillah. I would say what's amazing for me is that, for a long time in my life, I tried to work on my humility, on having that sincerity. It was interesting is when I first went into group therapy, and it was part of mandated for my program. Somebody in the group and said, what? I feel like you're always trying to portray something you're not. Literally, a non-Muslim, a colleague and a classmate said that to me, and that did more good for my humility than any other lectures I've heard. Somebody pointing it out to me in that blunt way. This was many years ago. I would say, really the vulnerability and having individuals that I open up to. That's been the biggest help for me. Just having mentors, if there's something more, seeking therapy, but really having consistent mentors, consistent individuals that I really open up to and share. But not an echo chamber, not just people who are not going to challenge me and who are just going to sing my tune, but really people who would point out things and who are willing to say, that's not how it happened. And so I think for me, vulnerability and having people that I open up to been like the biggest game changer.
Yeah, so I would say my favorite stress reliever of all is debating atheists. But beyond that, I would say like nothing has brought me more peace certainly than learning about Islam. Alhamdulillah, it's the biggest blessing in my life by far. I find the further I dive deeper into learning it, it brings me a sense of contentment, right, on topic. And I'll say this as well, that like when it comes to learning about Islam, a lot of times I sort of liken it to learning about, for example, like you might even say a lot of folks who try to argue against Islam might say things like, oh, it's like not modern or it doesn't fit a sort of like modern set of rules. When in reality, like Islam predates a lot of academic traditions. Like for example, like quantum physics is more recent than Islam, right? So like you have to think of it that way. Like we have a very rich academic tradition, and I like to spend time learning more and more about that, and I'll sort of explain why. The sort of second half to that is that I don't spend time on things that do not bring me peace. So you have to be very deliberate about your choices. That means listening to your body and seeing how you react to different situations. If something continuously brings you stress, at some point you have to decide whether it's healthy for you to continue in that act or it's an act of self-preservation to create some form of distance. So I'm very deliberate about my time, certainly, and how I use it. And I'd add too, and I go over this with patients very frequently, it's the difference between understanding activities of enjoyment and activities of fulfillment. And I think a lot of times we find that, certainly my patients conflate these concepts. Where, for example, I like playing sports, I play ball with friends all the time. Would I say it brings me fulfillment? I wouldn't say it brings me fulfillment. I enjoy it, it's a lot of fun when I'm there. But at the same time, you can say, like, for example, learning about Islam or learning about theology, like even the other Abrahamic faiths, for example, to make arguments for Islam over them. But I would say, like, that, for example, is not always easy. Sometimes it's in fact difficult for me, but once I leave that process, I feel like I've graduated a tier, for example, in my knowledge. And that can be stress relieving, actually, because you feel like you're better fit to enter, say, like other discussions and so on and so forth. So that's an activity of fulfillment. It may not necessarily always be one of enjoyment.
Jazakallah khair. Next question. How do you suggest helping your partner when they are struggling with depression or anxiety? How would we let those issues not affect the marriage? Anyone? These are good questions.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just use this opportunity to reiterate that it's, first of all, the best thing you can do is to be supportive first in a non-judgmental manner. So for example, like not coming down too hard on your partner. To say, for instance, like when someone is going through something difficult, I like to liken it actually to physical processes. So for example, you might say like, the classic sort of example I use in the clinic is when you have a patient who has, say, like congestive heart failure, okay? Now, it's usually like an older gentleman or a woman, and she's like, say she's walking down the street, and after a certain number of blocks, say it's like 6 or 7 blocks, you see them like wheezing, coughing, they're struggling to continue their walk. In a situation like that, you don't really feel like you want to come down hard on a person like that, right? It's actually quite the opposite. You feel like a degree of empathy, or your first response might be to try to help the person out. So certainly you want to respond in a non-judgmental way. The other half of it that I would argue is very, very important is kind of related to some of the things that we talked about earlier. It's, for example, keeping the bar on the lower side as opposed to the higher side for, say, like an evaluation. You can always make decisions about treatment planning with a professional in collaboration. So like a good psychiatrist will certainly collaborate with you. They'll want to hear your side of the story in its fullest extent, right? But then if you never really take that initial step, then many people end up sort of suffering in silence. And you can say like, that's unacceptable, right? So maybe helping your partner take that initial step to reach, very valuable help might be a good way to intervene.
So I'll just quickly add, so if we have crossed that hurdle of having them seek the professional help, how do you adjust in marriage? And I'll be very personal here. Just last week, I injured my back working out, whatnot. And for several days, I couldn't do anything in the house, right? And as someone that, as a guy, I want to take care of my wife and do my part and how so forth. And so, think about a physical injury. Think about a physical ailment, right? How would the impact marriage? Now, if it's something severe, like someone is schizophrenic or they're constantly in and out of the hospital, that can impact the marriage. And there are times when that marriage might not work. And I'm just being real. But if we're talking about they go through certain things at a level that's manageable, it's on both parties. How do we adjust? It's just like if you had a physical ailment or a physical disability, would you just divorce? Would you just give up? Or would you guys make it work because you love each other, right? That's really the question. So if there was already an issue in that marriage, this stress will break the marriage, right? And so it really depends on what level of mental health we're talking about. But I think it's on both parties. Sometimes the person who's going through depression also have to sort of realize that my partner has needs, and so I'm going to have to go beyond my comfort zone, right? Not just and at the same time the partner has to know that they are going through something at the moment, and my marriage is not going to look like similar to my friend's marriage or someone else's marriage, and if they're willing to accept that, then it can work.
I'll just quickly add, also, in terms of for yourself to potentially seek out help for yourself too, right? If we can't force others to go to therapy, even when it's our spouse, we can't, if they're not ready just yet. But like they said, being supportive, being there for them. But if you are not well versed on the topic, you don't understand it as well, then you as well going out of your way to learn about it and seeing with a therapist or with just anyone in the community who's been through it, a good friend, and kind of understanding like, how can I help my spouse do this? It's hard to answer in like just one or two simple things, like they said, because it's very specific to what your spouse is dealing with, but getting support for yourself as well, because sometimes in marriage, it's not sometimes, many times it's not 50-50, right? It's going to be sometimes you might have to put in that extra work to help your spouse get through this difficulty.
I'm just going to add one more thing briefly because the brother brought up an example. He mentioned schizophrenia, which is what we call, it's a disorder on what's called the psychotic spectrum. So it's very different from, say, disorders on what we call the neurotic spectrum. So like depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, these are typical, you can say, like examples of neurotic spectrum disorders. Something like schizophrenia is very, very different. And I bring this up just to say that there's a lot of value in doing a little bit of research on what the outcomes and severity differences are between the disorders, because it can be a life and death sort of move to be able to act expediently when you see like some of these symptoms burgeoning. So for example, you can say like schizophrenia symptoms, if you're talking like males, it's the typical sort of picture is that a young male, like maybe like age like 19, 20, comes in with what's called like a psychotic break. It's his first episode or experience with that kind of disillusionment from reality, right? So it's very, very useful to know, for example, that psychotic spectrum disorders might come with what we call earlier presentations, or they're also called prodromal syndromes. So they're sort of like, you can say like more subtle symptomatology leading into severe symptomatology. So even doing that little bit of research helps you make a decision about how quickly you might have to act.
We're going to go with one last question. I'm going to ask, just for the sake of time, for one of you, inshallah, to respond, whoever would like to take it on. How do we develop the motivation to move forward? I feel the pain in this question. And overcoming analysis paralysis. So one of you, who's the bold soul? Eeny, meeny, miny,
It's all good.
I think we spoke the most still. It's yours.
So can you repeat the question again? Apologies.
It disappeared. How do you develop the motivation to keep moving forward? So how do you break like analysis paralysis?
It's a really hard question, to be honest with you. I hope they can add a little more to this. I'm not sure if I'm going to answer in the best way possible, but I think when you feel stuck, right? It's really by evaluating what's happening in your life right now, what's happened in the past, and really looking at what has caused you to feel stuck, right? What are the barriers that you feel like you cannot move forward, right? Many of the times when we feel stuck, it's usually because of a disconnect that's within ourselves, that maybe we are not acknowledging something that's happened to us, where we're trying to move on way too quickly, right? So we want to move on from this per se paralysis, but maybe we haven't addressed what's actually happened, right? We haven't actually, gave ourselves the grace and compassion to be like, okay, let me process what's happening. So before kind of moving on, so I don't know if I answered the question exactly, but before moving on, really addressing, what happened and what did you address actually the issues that were there, and then for the next step, moving on. Okay, now I'm ready to go to the next step because I've actually addressed what's happened.
I don't want to add on because I'll open up a whole can of worms. But I do want to say that I was walking around and someone asked me, I asked them, what have we not addressed in the panel so far? And they told me, how do I find a therapist? Because the waiting line, the wait is immense. I mean, Khalid Center is booked, all the therapists are booked, and you guys are saying to find even Muslim therapists, forget it. How do we even do that, right? So I know the reality, and people reach out to me every day, to find a therapist. And so yes, I think we all said it's so helpful to have someone who knows your background, shares in your faith. But sometimes you have to find therapy for certain particular issues. You might not need a Muslim therapist, and that's okay. And I think it's important to see that and do that. And number two, as I was mentioning at the top of our panel, that since COVID-19, a lot of therapists just coming out of schools are opening up shops. That was never the case when when I was in the field. And what happens is without experience, they will not catch certain personality disorders, not catch certain trauma, but we have to work with what we have. And so as much as I might rail against that, I would say, we have very limited numbers of Muslim therapists anyways. And so inshallah there's benefit, there's khair in even seeking that. As long as, I'm sure they're practicing do no harm, right? So inshallah it's not gonna negatively affect you. So I don't want us to sit here and make it seem like you should also seek Muslim therapists or make it seem like you should go to super experience with a lot of certifications, because that is just not the reality of what we have to work with. So I would say, work with your insurance. But if someone's charging $300-400 for therapy, honestly, look for your health insurance covers behavioral therapy. So look for that first. Go to Psychology Today. Look for someone who takes your insurance before you pay out $300 for a session.
I'll just briefly add as well that I think there's a lot of value to being able to properly identify symptoms. So for instance, like you can say analysis paralysis, or I would say like a variant of that kind of description would be feeling like I'm stuck in loops, or like my brain is running in circles. These are sort of, you can say, like common descriptors that patients use for example, like a type of symptom called rumination, which is like a telltale feature of oftentimes generalized anxiety, many times obsessive compulsive symptoms. Beyond that, I think the beginning of the question was also related to developing motivation. To some degree, like there's a value in saying like sitting down and being able to practice like a degree of discipline and trying to almost like auto-generate motivation. But beyond that, there's a symptom called anhedonia, which is a telltale feature of major depressive disorder. So you want to be very particular about understanding like what your symptoms are. And I'll just reiterate from earlier today, I mentioned that there are clinical scales, which are basically like formalized, like numerical tools. They can be very helpful to make that differentiation. So I encourage, like, if there's some ambiguity you have about that you can always start with, say, like a clinical scale and then move from there.
Jazakumullah khairan for the responses. We'll try to share some of these resources I think that were mentioned. Maybe not all of us took notes. So we'll try to share that inshallah to all of you. Also, the really cool thing about this panel is everyone here is part of our local community, and they're part of our demographic. So this is not the end, inshallah. If you have open questions, hopefully that door will be open and we can help each other grow. I'm going to wrap up, inshallah, here. I just wanted to remind you guys with a few announcements. One, like I said, this is part 2 of a 3-part series, so there's going to be a 3rd part of the Contentment series. I think some of the panelists here kind of hinted at the importance of doing service and that being a factor to helping develop contentment. So the 3rd part of the installment will be more service-oriented, inshallah. We'll share more details about that online. We're also going to be sharing some content for Hajj and Dhul Hijjah. I don't know how many of you guys heard, but Imam Jawad just announced after Maghrib that tonight is the first of the of the 10 nights of the Hijjah, the 10 days of the Hijjah. So these are days that are really beloved to Allah, so opportunity for us to take advantage of it. We're going to be sharing some content online, so check out online on YouTube and Instagram, inshallah, you'll see that. There are a few of us in our community that are going for Hajj, so make dua for them. May Allah accept from them their Hajj. May Allah allow them to come back completely free of sin. And for those of us who haven't had the opportunity to go yet, may Allah allow us to go soon and accept it from us all. Last couple things. We just sent out a feedback survey to your email addresses, so we would love to hear your feedback, so please check it out, inshallah. Try to do it now before you leave, so this way you don't forget. And finally, if you could help us with cleaning up some things, inshallah, as you wait on your way out, if you can, just help us with folding some chairs and cleaning up, and if there's any garbage, help throw that out. جزاكم الله خيرا سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد ان لا اله الا انت نستغفرك ونتوب اليك